All right, so today I want to be able to acknowledge my collaborators and my colleagues, Professor Mark Weston, Professor Paul Borum and Professor Lorraine Mazarol. Today what I want to do is give you a brief overview of the project, talk a little bit about our sampling method and a snapshot of the sample and some very preliminary findings. And when I mean preliminary, I've just gotten this data set has been cleaned and given to me in the last 2 days. So I have literally not spent a lot of time getting to know what's in the data. It's a very, very comprehensive data set. There are a lot of questions around terrorism, around natural disasters. Okay, so the idea behind this survey was to benchmark attitudes of Australian residents with regards to national security policy, terrorist and natural disaster risk and preparedness, crime and victimisation, political and social values, and government effectiveness and legitimacy. So part of the context that this survey is situated in is that post 9/11, the Australian government has emphasised policy and practice around national security to make Australians safer. And the all hazards approach is an approach that the Australian government has adopted. And this is basically to say that in terms of disaster management, the way in which the government will respond to terrorism is very similar, if not the same, as its response to natural disasters. This study is designed to contribute to both policy and the literature in criminology and sociology. In terms of disaster policy, we're trying to understand how and why Australians prepare, where they get their information about preparedness and about disasters, and what they think about the current security policy. In terms of the theoretical literature, we're trying to understand how what we already know about risk and fear helps us understand these things in terms of particularly around terrorism and national security, as well as things like social values and civic action, and very importantly, perceptions of the community. And you'll see that I talk a little bit about how important that actually is. This is the conceptual model that drove the survey. We are primarily interested in looking at and understanding preparedness and personal well-being in terms of personal security as a part of Australians' well-being. Of course, we incorporated a lot of other different elements to the survey that are surrounding community perceptions, government legitimacy, as well as police legitimacy, social values and social capital, as well as your demographics. And the other thing that we incorporated here is the element of experience, those people who've experienced disasters previously. There are 4 core research questions that guided this survey. How do incidents affect attitudes of risk and threat perception? How does exposure to information affect confidence in government? And how do perceptions of risk or threat influence personal security? And lastly, how do perceptions of the community affect preparedness behaviour? We had a sample of 6,590 randomly sampled Australians that were contacted via random sampling over the telephone, and they were asked to participate in a 2-minute, very short phone survey on disaster preparedness. After they'd finished that 2-minute survey, we then asked if they would be willing to participate in a longer study where they would fill out our main survey by either mail or online. Of those 6,590 people who participated in that first very short survey, a little over 6,000 of them agreed to go on and fill out our main survey. And of those little over 6,000, we got 4,258 returned that were completed. Now, our target sample for the main survey was 4,500. So we actually got fairly close to what we expected, and a lot of people on the team thought that it was going to be quite a challenge even to get that with such a long survey that was administered via mail or online. So we were quite pleased that our sample came back, and that's roughly 69% return rate of those who said that they would participate. I should also mention that we have an oversample in the ACT because of the number of potential national targets or buildings that are of national importance that could possibly elicit feelings around terrorism and national security, we did want to include an oversample in the ACT. Now, at the time this survey was administered, this was this last summer that we just had, there were a number of natural disasters that were actually happening during that time. So we already had some flooding in New South Wales, Victoria and in Queensland during that survey. So it's possible that those events could actually affect some of our responses. However, because we asked people in the 2-minute survey about what they'd done to prepare, and we also re-asked that question in the main survey, one of the unique things about this sample is that we're actually going to be able to compare what they did at the time that they were called, and if that changed by the time that they filled out the main survey, which could be anywhere between 2 weeks to 6 weeks after they were initially called. Some of our just very brief sample characteristics. We have an average age of just over 50 years, which is fairly normal from a phone survey. One of the drawbacks of doing phone surveys is that we do tend to get an older sample, and this is actually something that those of us who are working at ISSR at University of Queensland are trying to understand how we can do surveys better so that we can get a much more representative sample in future surveys. We have about 58% female, 95% are Australian citizens, and 1% identify as Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. We also collected a lot of information around national identity, ethnic identity, region of birth, and as well as some very detailed labour market indicators, people's participation in the labour market as well. And there's a quick distribution of our educational achievement sample. Now, the first question that we wanted to look at when we got the data back was, what are people actually doing to prepare? And we grouped these types of behaviours. We asked specifically about 7 of them, which are listed down the side. Developing emergency plans, stockpiling supplies, purchasing safety equipment, duplicating important documents, reduced airplane travel, reduced travel by train, and reduced use of public transportation. And we grouped these into 2 groups. The first group, which is in blue, which is the first 4, are those that we consider proactive behaviours, the things that people do to make themselves and their families and households safer. The last 3, the ones in purple, are things that we refer to as fear-based behaviours. These are things that people are avoiding because they think that there's inherent risk in doing those things, specifically around terrorism. What we found here is that duplicating important documents as well as reduced airplane travel are the most common things that people have actually said, we are doing these because of terrorism. We also think that the community context of the way in which people behave is also important, and so we wanted to ask our respondents whether or not they'd seen other people in their communities, do they know of other people that are doing things to prepare for potential terrorist activity. And what we find here is actually fairly similar. Again, duplicating important documents and reduced airplane travel is something that people are seeing, and actually it's a greater extent. Almost 20% of the sample say that people they know of in their community or around them are actually reducing their air travel because specifically of terrorism. So there is this element of fear around the way that people prepare for terrorism. One of the things we weren't able to do when we did a pilot study was ask people about where they got their information, and this was a question we added to our main survey. Now, a lot of this is not necessarily surprising. The majority of our respondents are getting their information from television, radio, and newspapers. One of the things to keep in mind here is that if we just looked at our people in the younger cohort, the amount that they're getting from the internet is quite a bit more than that. One of the reasons that this question is so important is because moving forward, one of the things that we're hoping to learn is, are there particular messages about terrorism preparedness that are more salient through particular media outlets more than others? Now, only about 25% of our sample have done anything at all to do specifically with preparing for terrorism. And so we were wondering why it might be so low. We thought perhaps it's got something to do with knowledge, how much people think they know about terrorism preparedness. And we ask this question specifically as it relates to terrorism and again as it relates to natural disasters. And we ask them how much the respondents think they know about how to prepare for a potential terrorist attack, where to go to get preparation information about preparedness, and what to do when a warning is issued. And lastly, we also ask them what they know about what the government actually recommends that you do to prepare. And as you can see, for terrorism, people overall really feel like they don't know very much about this as it relates to terrorism. They really feel like their knowledge is very, very low. They don't know very much about preparedness. They don't know where to go to get information, specifically as it relates to keeping their households safer under the threat of a terrorist attack. However, this is one of the interesting things about getting to compare what people think about terrorism to natural disasters, keeping in mind that overall disaster response is going to be under that all hazards approach. People do, and this is probably largely related to experience, people do feel like they know a lot more about preparedness, where to go to get information, what to do when a warning is issued, and what the government recommends that they do when it comes to natural disasters. So what this seems to suggest to us is that even though the government policy and the disaster management policy might carry an all hazards approach, that's certainly not how Australian residents are perceiving preparing for disasters. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. We have a set of questions in the survey that we are really excited about, and these questions tap into kind of social control around national security. This is something that hasn't really been done before, certainly not in the Australian context. We ask a set of questions that are around what do people do if they see something suspicious. I have only just got one example of this here, and we asked what Australian residents would do if they thought they saw something suspicious. And the majority of them, almost 90% of the survey respondents said that they would call their local police department. What's interesting here, and I haven't reported these results, but one of the things we looked at in this survey, as in the preliminary results, but also this is mirrored in the pilot survey, is that when it comes to how sure people are about the federal, state and local government separately, are able to protect, help them recover and respond to terrorist disasters and natural disasters. When it comes to terrorism, people are most sure about the federal government's ability, which is really interesting because under that all hazards approach, the primary responders are going to be the local and the state government. However, here what's interesting about that is even though they have most, trust or most assured in the federal government's ability, people are more likely to talk about suspicious behaviour with their neighbours than they are to call the National Security Hotline. Okay? So this again, we think that this might be an initial indication that again, that neighbourhood context is really important to social control around terrorism issues, on top of some of the other issues that we already know is important for the community, like regular crime and other types of social problems. All right, so we've got a couple of, policy and research implications here. In terms of policy, the government obviously has this all hazards approach to disaster response, recovery and monitoring. However, Australians perceive and prepare for terrorism differently than they do for natural disasters. So respondents are seeing this behaviour seeing this behaviour reflected in their community. A lack of preparedness might be linked to a lack of knowledge. They really do feel like they don't know a lot about terrorism. But what's interesting, and I think what the challenge is from a policy perspective here, is that we should perhaps do a better job of showing Australian residents that their knowledge and their experience in natural disasters is actually quite transferable in terms of preparedness, at least, for other types of disasters as well, whether they be man-made, whether they be terrorist-related. Our research implications, these are some of the things that we are kind of looking forward to understanding more now that we have the data, is the relationship between the confidence in government. That's all three levels of government that we look at: local, state and federal government, and people's action towards preparedness is actually quite complicated. And the reason that it's complicated, that we think, and this is again based on our pilot study that we did last year, just in Queensland, is that that element of neighbouring and the community seems to mediate that relationship between government and preparedness, messages from government and preparedness. So that's something that moving forward we'd really like to look at in more detail. Some of our more immediate plans for the future. We're going to be looking at how certain attitudes about government responsibility, whether or not people think government should be more responsible about preparedness, or whether or not individuals should be taking this responsibility on themselves, whether or not how this is actually affecting people's behaviour around preparedness, what the impact the federal government's national security policy has on the willingness to report potential terrorist threats, how the presence of immigrants and racial and ethnic minorities and communities affect civic responsibility, and particularly around action towards preparedness behaviour, action towards keeping their communities, their households and their families safer. If and why, and also lastly, we're also very interested in looking at if and why immigrants and ethnic minorities' attitudes differ substantially from the rest of the Australian population around the causes of terrorism and what the response should be about it. We're also considering doing another future wave of the National Security and Preparedness Survey, and we would really like to be able to include an ethnic oversample. As I said, one of the things that we think will be really important, particularly for terrorism, is understanding how these perceptions differ between ethnic groups in the Australian context. And Professor Robert Crutchfield from the University of Washington will be coming out to join us in February of 2013 to help us look at some modelling around race and ethnic relations and national security, particularly around that social control element. And I think I will leave it there.